Welcome to the Momentum Flow podcast, where ideas, innovations, and experiences are shared to create continuous stream of inspiration and insight. Join me, your host, Luis Solana, a supply chain expert and investor, as I uncover how visionary founders, operators, and leaders are spotting opportunities, sparking innovation, and scaling profitable growth. From plan to cash, I bring real-world experience and an investor's eye to reveal how clarity, capital, and conviction fuel sustainable growth. Tune in and let's keep the momentum flow going. Welcome to the Momentum Flow podcast, where ideas, innovation, and experiences create a continuous stream of inspiration and insight. Join me, your host, Luis Solana, a supply chain expert turned investor, as I uncover how visionary founders, operators, and leaders are spotting opportunities, sparking innovation, and scaling profitable growth. From plan to cash, I blend real-world operating experience with an investor lenses to reveal how clarity, capital, and conviction fuel sustainable growth. Today, we're diving into complexity, technology, and transformation reshaping the automotive supply chain. And there's no better guide on this topic than our guest, Chris Stiles. Chris brings 30 years of experience across logistics, procurement, vehicle distribution, international operations, Six Sigma, and today he leads the America's end-to-end supply chain of Nissan, a major Japanese multinational automaker. Chris, welcome to the Momentum Flow.
Well, thank you, Luis, and it's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate you inviting me and really look forward to a great discussion today.
I appreciate you joining, Chris. So let's start that. That's why I know you, obviously, but it would help the audience if you share a bit about your career journey, your early days in the automotive world, and how now leading supply chain management across the Americas works for Nissan in your case.
Yeah, I'll start. Like you said, 30 years really working within supply chain, specifically automotive. Started my career, basically working within transportation operations started with a trucking company and quickly moved to work for a third-party logistics company, working directly for a major automotive company on service parts distribution in the U.S., and then transitioned and spent about 3 years doing the same in Mexico at that time. So from there, I was able to transition into the retail side of the automotive business for a couple of years, really setting up their Mexico logistics networks. And then since then, I've spent over 23 years here at Nissan, working in logistics, procurement, supply chain related activities for all of those years. Within that time period, I've held a number of different positions in leadership. Some of that also I was back in Mexico as well, managing the procurement side of the operations in Mexico. And then for about the past 13 years, I've been based here in the U.S. leading, whether it's logistics, and it's evolved into the complete supply chain operations. And as you said, it's really kind of the end-to-end. It's everything from production planning and really setting up the plants for what they need to manufacture, all the inbound parts, logistics, inventory control, finished vehicle distribution, and then all the upstream activities as well around, engineering and logistics design and all of those parts of the operation to help support the manufacturing facilities. So been in it for quite a while now, and learned a lot and still learning. So
30 years in an industry, and 23 of them the same company, and yes, with a very broad scope. But how do you keep yourself motivated and continuous evolving?
I think it's part of it is the evolution of the supply chain side of the business. I mean, to me, it continues to evolve. I used to tell my team, if we're doing our job, we should be invisible to the organization because, parts are flowing to manufacturing facilities, finished vehicles are getting delivered to customers. And if everything's going as it should be with our supply base, with our manufacturing operations, then we're pretty much invisible. But that has completely changed over the last several years to where I think the supply chain role has taken a much higher precedence in the overall organization of the company, much more of a strategic role, involved in a lot more of the decision-making process, to support the business. So I think the evolution of all that is what keeps it interesting. It's something different every day. And as new things come in, and new technologies, new innovations, new strategies. It keeps it interesting. It's kind of, we talk about supply chain challenges. I like to call them puzzles. And I always tell my team, I hope you like doing puzzles, because if you work in supply chain, that's pretty much what we do every day. So it's kind of the curiosity and puzzle factor that I think keeps me motivated.
That's a great analogy. Puzzle making is always a skill that is very cherished by supply chain professionals. So, as you know, I spent myself years on the supplier side of the auto industry with Bridgestone as a tier one, with Henkel as a tier two. And we were always balancing global manufacturing capabilities internally with OEM expectations, right? Now, you from the OEM perspective as a leader in the industry, what is one misconception that suppliers often have about how OEMs make supply chain and sourcing decisions?
I think it's evolved, and some years ago, the conception, or what was probably the part of the backbone of what was driving supply chain decisions wasn't necessarily a supply chain driven decision. It was much more on cost factors and looking at how does a total delivered cost appear maybe up front on paper versus the real world impacts of the total cost when you bring the supply chain aspect into it for parts delivery and for things like that. So I think, as part of that that changing landscape, and really kind of getting the suppliers to understand that from an OEM perspective, that we are also evolving. We're trying to find ways to really evolve, to work closer with the supply base, and really kind of move away from more of a transactional type relationship to more of a holistic partnership type relationship. And I know it's not always evident, but I think that's something that's kind of taking place, not just with Nissan, but within the industry.
Yeah, as suppliers, they always deal with intense cost pressure, quality, delivery expectations by the OEMs. On their side, OEMs often feel pressed on the system level resiliency they need to have and the market responsiveness to remain competitive. Where do you see alignment and where do you see tension between supplier reality and OEM expectations?
Yeah, I think the challenge, especially in automotive, when you've got such long lead times from product design development to actual implementation, and the expectations that come into that when you're working with the suppliers, and what should the expectations be on volumes, on kind of the ranges of capacity that should be required, which obviously pushes back into supplier investment, that there needs to be, and there is, certain parameters around that. And I think the OEMs are seeing that, under the best intentions, you set those parameters, you come to alignment with the supply base, but then things change. So as they change, I think it's got to be a more open relationship of, okay, things are changing. How do we work together to help adjust so that the suppliers are not negatively impacted, same as the OEM, trying to find the best ways to be as agile as possible, but there's limitations, and then you kind of have to start looking at alternative ways to work together whenever those big swings come in place. But if you can keep your forecasting and your predictability within certain ranges, it helps everybody.
On that same token, from your perspective, what differentiates a good supplier from a great strategic partner for an OEM?
Well, a good supplier obviously is one that sticks to their commitment, and basically, they supply great quality, they supply on time, and they're able to manage, their cost parameters. I think when you shift from that into a partner, it's more of the supplier's ability to fulfill that role of being maybe the expert themselves in whatever that commodity is that the OEM requires. So we're really starting to lean more on our suppliers to bring forth ideas, concepts, other ways to optimize from their side based on what they do, what they see maybe with other customers, things that they see that maybe we could do differently or better, to help kind of bring the ideas forward so that our team can analyze them also, and hopefully they're ideas that we can utilize. But it's really kind of that proactive need that we have from the supplier partners to really give them the confidence that we're going to listen, right? Hey, bring it to us, we're going to listen, versus maybe in years past it's my design, it's my concept, you just make it for me and don't say anything. So I think that's really what we're seeing in a lot of areas.
That's fantastic. I think suppliers will love to hear OEMs speaking that language. So uh, let's dive a little bit into the state of the industry, in the auto industry in general. So, how would you describe the current state of the automotive supply chain in general? What seems fragile? What is improving? How do you see the auto supply chain?
I think the fragility still comes from external factors. It's obviously there's external factors that impact the supply chain, whether it's geopolitical factors, it could be tariffs, it could be any other types of restrictions or regulations that are coming into play that maybe were not foreseen or expected. And then you have all the normal supply chain impactful events, such as whether it's weather or any other kind of I would say large events that could impact our ability to keep the supply chain moving. And that side of it's something, the better we get at finding tools to help with predictability, visibility, and scenario planning in the event of specific types of events, which I think we learn from each on how we should do better the next time. But a lot of it is that scenario planning, trying to get more proactive than reactive for when those unknowns come, because they're going to continue to come.
On that regard, so volatility. There's volatility in the supply. There's volatility in the demand. There's volatility in the international logistics on an OEM side. What do you see? Is there a structural opportunity more on the demand side, more on the supply side? How do you see
Yeah, yeah.
both sides? Yeah.
Well, I think when you look upstream on the demand side, yes. I mean, there's that. I think we can always do better at our demand and forecast planning and utilization of tools to help, I would say, speed up that decision-making process.
Hmm.
So implementing those types of tools that help do the scenario planning and quickly give you some decision points that previously may have taken, weeks to pull together those scenarios, but utilizing a lot of tools that are available now on trying to be as I would say forecasting capable as we can. And from a months out standpoint, even a years out standpoint, versus what would have has always been a much more manual type of process, at least in our world, and really finding ways that you help optimize that part of the process upstream. Because the better we are at that, then the more stability flows through from that upstream part all the way into the downstream as well. And that again helps everybody as well from a supply planning, demand planning, capacity planning, all of those other areas.
As electrical vehicle adoption, continues evolving, is that affecting more or less the forecasting, the production planning, supply capacity decisions, or they're just different, a different production line? How do you see the electrical vehicle supply chain itself?
I think it's a challenge because of the volatility that we've seen as of late. Because at the end of the day, at least here in the U.S., the electric vehicle, I think, demand is going to be consumer driven. And we've seen recently kind of how that's gone up and down from a consumer standpoint. So obviously that drives everything back into the production side. And so I think it's been a challenge based on what a lot of companies have originally planned for, how it's evolved, and now they're having to adjust to the point that they can to get things back into a more stable environment, and then trying to get better again at, okay, what does that true demand look like? What does it look like for the next 6 months, for the next year, for the next 3 years, 5 years? Because it's almost like it has to be reworked at this point versus kind of what we've seen happen and play out over the last year or so.
No, that's excellent. I agree with your perspective. It's still a supply chain that is evolving. A lot of it driven by technology, new technology in itself. So just going into technology a little bit. So in recent episodes, several of my guests that talk with them about AI's move really from experimentation to operationalization. How does that work inside Nissan supply chain? Is AI making uh, any impact, or where is making the biggest impact? Do you see a breakthrough in the horizon? What's your perspective on AI?
AI, my perspective is it's another tool. right? It's another evolving tool, and I don't know that we know yet kind of where the limits would be. So as it's been evolving, yes, we've been implementing it in several areas of the business. From an upstream standpoint, I talked about demand. We call it demand and supply integration, which is basically S&OP types of activities where you can utilize AI for a lot of that scenario planning and decision proposal types of options. And then it kind of from that upstream phase evolving more into everything from, how do we plan our optimized logistics operations for a future model? So if we have a future model that's going to come online in 2 years, how do we get AI to help us at least provide optimized supply chain scenarios, whether it's sourcing decisions, locations, volumes, all of those things to help us quickly get to what does optimized scenario A, B, C look like, and then you can start digging into versus chasing every scenario. Excuse me. So as it plays into that, then we're using it for things like packaging engineering as well. So as you start optimizing and understanding what that supply chain is going to look like, well, then you've got a packaging engineering question. How can you use AI to help you much faster design, what those true packaging designs should look like? That can play into everything from inventory control. We're using AI to create algorithms for what should proper float levels be, as far as how we should be managing our inventory floats, depending on origins and usage and all of those things. It quickly helps you at least, again, create what it considers optimized, and then you can tweak it as you go. And then it can play into things, such as, more day-to-day tasks of, most asked questions, what's the ETA of this shipment, and you can utilize it for things like that maybe the plant is asking for. So
So on that topic, let me ask you. Let's go into three different areas on the technology. One is more the digital control tower, then a little bit on planning, a little bit on transportation. So on the digital control tower first, that's more of a table stakes right now, right? Everybody has some way of controlling their supply chain. I presume your team is using real-time visibility across suppliers, logistics, manufacturing. Is that evolving to be more proactive than the reactive to just prevent disruptions before they anticipate them?
yeah, I'll give you an example of something we've developed over the past couple of years. From a control tower viewpoint, it's more around visibility and predictability. So we mapped our entire supply chain, not just the tier one, but all the way to the tier ends and raw materials. And so we've mapped out where basically every component, subcomponent, raw material originates. And then from there, it all goes into basically an automated system that helps flag potential risk points. It helps flag, it could be a disruption, and then we get alerts. And oftentimes we'll get the alerts before even our tier one suppliers would get them. So then it's not it doesn't give complete predictability, but at least it helps us move much quicker than we would have before. So that's one thing we've done from a control tower standpoint. So that's all automated as far as getting alerts. We get alerts on cyber attacks across our supply base. We get alerts on, any kind of, even at times it could be a financial disruption across our supply base. So that's one way we've been able to utilize it, at least to help play into the visibility, predictability, and being able to react much better than we would have before. But you can't predict everything. So it's still something that helps us much differently than before.
Yeah. For sure, as you said, and I like how you worded this, technology is another tool to just be more proactive, be able to better manage the supply chain. Is that insight from the mapping of source destination percolating to demand planning, to planning itself, whether it's demand sensing or predictive analytics, scenario modeling, and then with that does that help Nissan to improve accuracy, agility, or they're still siloed planning versus?
No, it's we're bringing it all together within the supply chain umbrella, which before it would have been siloed. So the mapping was kind of the first step. So just having the mapping now, it can play back into the demand and capacity planning side of knowing what are certain limitations maybe from a specific supplier from a capacity standpoint versus what we're planning for demand. It can help, from a risk assessment standpoint. It's interesting because once we did the supply chain mapping and we have it pretty much at our fingertips, another example is tariffs. So we can see where a tier one supplier may have a tariff risk based on where their tier in supply chain is and what they're importing into the U.S. So we can see that even oftentimes again before the tier one can. It can also play into UFLPA requirements. If you start looking at U.S. regulations, where are all of the components truly coming from around the world? It helps you get visibility into that to see if you have any risk points or your suppliers have any risk points. So the mapping was the first step. It was getting all that together, getting it optimized because we had to do it globally. We had to do it because we source from many countries and thousands of suppliers. So we had to get the entire thing set up from a global standpoint. And then now that we have it, we can manage it much faster and optimize, well, not just optimize it, but anytime it needs to be updated, you're only updating a handful of points within that information and that data versus trying to look at it, from a whole to where it's almost overwhelming.
That's interesting that you're starting to see the interconnectivity on really a control tower solution. From my perspective, and you know that in recent times have pivoted more towards investing in supply chain. So I see a lot of activity around innovation in transportation, finished vehicle logistics. Um, there's a lot of technology from telematics, Internet of Things, digital freight platforms, yard automations, warehouse automations. Are any of those changing the work at your company? Are you being able to leverage some of those tools?
Yeah, basically we look at it a few different ways. One way is going back to kind of the partnership concept. That's not just with our parts suppliers, that's also with our logistics providers. So there are certain areas where our expectation is that those providers look at themselves internally and where can they be optimizing and using technology to help them in their day-to-day operations. So we're more dependent on them since they're the experts to find ways that they can do that, whether it's the railroads, the truckers, the shipping companies, the ocean carriers. And so we're seeing a lot of innovation from their side where they are making investments to help with their capacity management, to help with their optimization, to help with their fuel management, their CO2 emissions, and all of those things. On the internal side, for what we would say we manage within the Nissan organization is things like we're looking at autonomous yard trucks. We've been doing proofs of concept on autonomous yard trucks, on autonomous forklifts, or remote controlled forklifts, on using drones for inventory cycle counting within warehouses, using other types of robotics for warehouse management operations, using automated storage and receipt systems, which have advanced tremendously from a robotic standpoint. So there's a lot of those that are in flight at different stages. Some are initial stages, some are implementing now, some have already been implemented. So it really just kind of depends on where it is. And then once we find kind of the best concept or the best, I would say, solution, then how do we cross deploy it across the region? So if we find the right warehouse management system, which we've done, the right transportation management system, how do we cross deploy it so it's not just utilized at one location? It's done in the U.S., it's done in Mexico, it's done in Brazil, so that if it's truly the right solution, then we should be able to utilize it for like types of operations, across the region.
So it's obvious that you have a lot of balls in the air trying to move ahead and improve your supply chain. Kudos on that. There's always more, right? So, if you, in the spirit of the new year, let's say and pretend that you can ask for one thing on the technology side, and that wish will be granted to you. Which technological capability would solve most headaches for you if you had it today?
Well, it's coming, but it really goes back to that demand and supply integration side. It's coming, but it's still in development right now. I think that's really what kickstarts how the supply chain operates. So the more accurate we get from a demand to supply to manufacturing, then that just evolves into ton of efficiencies and improvements that flow all the way through the supply chain. So that's something we're actively working on. I won't have it tomorrow. I wish I could, but I'll have it in the near future. So
Yeah, I totally agree. I think when you're able to integrate demand and supply and really have an integrated business planning process, that becomes the backbone of an organization. So
mhm.
yeah, I couldn't agree more with you on that. So let's pivot to the other side of your world. You do a lot of the, you manage a big procurement team, right? A large organization, and on that regard, there's a lot of strategy, negotiation, resiliency building. So and you have the power of negotiating at scale. So how does that work in a modern organization like Nissan? How does world-class supplier management strategy look for you in this year, next year? How do you manage that complexity?
A couple of points, and I mentioned about the partnership, but it's also how are how can we become a better customer across the supply base? We want to be the company that suppliers want to work with. So how do we become that customer? And in part of doing that, as I mentioned, listening to the suppliers and really asking them for their feedback. That's part of it too. But when you start talking about complexity reduction and taking advantage of scale, how do we work with those suppliers to maybe find ways that we can better compete by using maybe off the shelf types of components, things like that, maybe that an end customer wouldn't see, but components that would be considered more off the shelf. They haven't been completely redesigned. We didn't redesign the wheel. There's something that they already do, they already have, whether it's for us or for others, that can work within our design and manufacturing network. How do we find those economies of scale jointly with the suppliers? Because helping them build economies of scale, it just helps basically their sustainability also. So that's been a big effort as of late to really try and minimize complexity that we drive maybe back into the supply base by utilizing, I'll say, as I said, off the shelf type mentality of, if it's something that's there, it's good quality, it does exactly what is needed, then how do we consider that versus consistently in the past, redesigning maybe some of those components.
Mm. It's interesting because you and I we share that you obviously for a longer time, a longer period of time, but we both work for Japanese companies, and
Mhm.
they're famous for having a lot of just-in-time mentality on how they operate, and that helps optimize inventory. But what is the impact? Trying to balance supply chain complexities in today's reality, longer lead times. I presume inventories in general, your inventories are are tactically going up in certain commodities, or how are you managing inventory? That's the question.
It really depends on a lot of factors. I mean, obviously origin and lead times and I would say taking in any potential risk factors, whether it's transportation capacity, it could be other events that can create some type of disruption. I think at the end of the day, it's really trying to find the sweet spot from an inventory standpoint. For just in time, there's always going to be, the required just in time types of parts that's really the only way that they're going to operate. But then when you look at the ones that are not considered just in time, what's the sweet spot of the right level of inventory to have in transit, in house, to where you're really pushing the limits, knowing that at times you're probably going to hit a risk point where you're gonna have an issue, and you're going to have to supplement for that inventory, whether it's air freight or something else. But taking that into account and willing to accept that you're going to have that, but you put it in the grand scheme of the business, the free cash flow impacts of the inventory, the potential, we'll say, cost that's outside of the norm when you do have to expedite or do something like that. But there's still a sweet spot there, because if you're really pushing the limits, there will be times where you're going to have an inventory disruption and you have to compensate for it. But in the grand scheme, it should still calculate better than if you're just sitting on too much inventory all the time. So that's something that we've really focused on.
Well, so one last question on this section. So you're sourcing from a lot of places, right? So from the U.S., from Mexico, from Japan, from Latin America, and leave aside safety and people management. Those are table stakes to me. I think every organization, a supply chain leader, you're managing those, and they're part of or the DNA of any company. But at the end, you always need to balance between service, quality, cost, and I would argue that, okay, let's say cash management, inventory management, right?
Mhm.
So I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you had to force rank them, and I know that it's impossible, right? So there's a little bit of all of them, but what if you had to force rank them? How would you prioritize those four: service, quality, cost, and inventory, cash?
Yeah, I think again it varies depending on which commodity we're talking about. But
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we need to have the cost factor historically would have been the number one driver, cost and free cash. So now they're still top drivers, but I think the quality side has become more precedent as well, and just consistency of supply. Because one thing we've had to do, in the past, looking at trying to calculate what the future cost was going to be of you know, part management and logistics management, all those things, you now have to take into account what we've learned as potential other factors. They're going to come into play, and you have to be able to calculate something and allocate something for those when you do your complete analysis. So, it's easy to put on paper a perfect world scenario figure of, okay, my normal transit time is going to be this. I need this much inventory. This is my cost. This is my free cash flow. But you've got to add a factor in for disruptions. You got to add a factor in for tariffs or for other things that now have to be part of the discussion, because if you do a look back on what maybe was calculated and what was predicted 3 years ago, and if you do a look back, okay, what was the actual result, oftentimes they're quite different now. So that's one thing we're really trying to take a hard look at, working with our global partners in Japan, and really kind of making sure that we are trying to include all those necessary factors versus maybe a shorter list of factors before.
That that comment is a perfect lead into the next section about your perspective of the evolution of maybe being a little centric North America over the next decade, right? Because with and you mentioned tariffs a couple of times, but all the multi-shoring efforts in a lot of OEMs and in different industries as well, labor constraints and port congestions. So the supply chain is transforming, right? That's the reality. And which of those challenges, what keeps you awake at night? Which of those challenges is it more tariffs, labor, near shoring, and again, it probably varies by the different product line, but in general, which are your which is your biggest nightmare at night?
I think the biggest one is when you have an unexpected disruption, and then your alternative options are very limited. So I think that's where it gets quite complicated on, finding the right alternative options versus a disruption that was completely unexpected. If you've heard recently about the aluminum factory fire in New York. So obviously an unexpected event, which with major ramifications across the industry. It could be semiconductor related. It could be those things that that were unexpected, and when your alternative options are limited, that's the biggest challenge. When you talk about North American manufacturing and kind of what ideal may look like, I think the simple answer is, buy where you produce where you sell. That should be kind of the underlying strategy, but it's
Mhm.
not. It's never 100% possible. But the more you can do that, the more you really eliminate all of these external factors that can come in and create the disruption. So I
Right.
think, you know, easier said than done, but I think that needs to be the starting point, for each of the automotive companies and even the suppliers as well, that really should focus on minimizing the potential for disruptions.
Yeah, yeah, local for local, and they be in the perfect world, right? So
Mhm.
that's very good. So one last question on North America. So or even Americas. Now, how do you see? Think 10 years out, or 5 years out at least. Maybe 10 is too long. 5 years out. What will differentiate the automotive supply chains that will win over that period of time? Which are the really the attributes that those supply chains will have?
It just part of it's what I just said, as far as figuring out how to minimize potential disruptions. So those supply chains that can eliminate potential disruptions are going to have the advantage. And then I think the ones that, you're always still going to have risk points, the better that we can all get at scenario and risk planning is going to be the other one. And really trying to look at, we've seen what disruptions look like for the past several years. We should have learned from them. And what would we have done differently if we had known those disruptions were coming, and start acting that way up front before we finalize sourcing decisions and things like that.
It's interesting because in this conversation, when I reflect on your insights, I could probably bucket them in there are things around alignment that you mentioned and demand and supply planning, around agility, the local for local, the managing the supplier base, but also remain adaptable and flexible to changes because the reality is change will continue, right? You and I don't know what will continue, but that's part of the professional supply chain leader is there's so you know that every day when you wake up there's going to be a news and an email that's going to tell you they're going to influence your day every day. So uh, I want to pivot this last section. We talk about the industry, we talk about technology, but I want to talk about Chris, right? And obviously, one of the things that I cherish from these conversations is the leadership lessons that my guests bring to the table to share with others. Across the roles you've had, what is the toughest? Go back in memory lane. What is the toughest supply chain moment you had to navigate, and what did it teach you? How did you do it? What did it teach you?
That's a tough question, but if I go back and say probably the toughest one among many was probably in 2011 during the earthquake and tsunami crisis in Japan. And I think that quickly showed many of us in the industry that we did not have a good view of what our supply chains were. And I think that's really what kickstarted a lot of the activity around supply chain visibility and contingency planning and things like that. And so some of that continued to evolve, and then you get into the pandemic, you get into semiconductor crisis, you get into, anything as of late. I think that's kind of what helped kickstart, the need to get the supply chain to the forefront of from a visibility standpoint and business impact standpoint, because that was a huge challenge when that occurred.
Yeah, that's one that I wouldn't have thought of because I wasn't working for a Japanese company at the
Yeah,
time. But I can
yeah,
see how that even probably was larger than COVID. I still saw in my turn of region a little bit of the remnants of that. So
yeah.
I fully understand that. Fully understand that. That's a great example. Um, at the end, as you lead a lot of people, right? You have a large team. Uh, how do you build and develop that next generation of supply chain leaders that you have? I always think that that's part of the responsibility of supply chain leaders. Who's going to be sitting in your job, the next generation? How do you build that, develop them?
You know, that's interesting from one thing that we saw a few years ago. I mean, the skill set needed for, I'll call it a supply chain analyst or a supply chain manager, has changed immensely in the last, let's say, 10 years. It's not so much the ability to run spreadsheets and chase parts and, track vehicle distribution and things like that. It's really evolved into much more of a skill set around data analytics and the ability to use technologies. So when we identified that a few years ago, we developed an internal supply chain, what we call supply chain innovation team. So we brought in actually externally some data scientists, and we paired them with some of our, I'll say, kind of operational, operationally experienced team members, and put them in a separate group that we titled, from an innovation standpoint. Their sole purpose in the beginning was look to the future, and look to the future not only for what technologies we need, but also what skill sets we need. So one thing that evolved from that is we created a supply chain data analytics academy, to where we have internal supply chain scientists who teach data analytics to our other supply chain analysts at all different levels. And we do it based on a hand raising type process for those that are interested in learning this additional skill set to help them in their day-to-day job. And so we created this academy to where we can teach internally. So we're doing that, but aside, we also work with a number of universities really trying to keep tabs on, okay, what's coming next? What do those skill sets need to look like for students coming out of the universities, whether it's undergrad or higher levels, and working and participating actively with a lot of universities on what should be occurring from the university side to help evolve into, what kind of our needs are going to be, tomorrow, but then several years down the road. So I think we've identified all that. We don't have a target kind of goal. I think it's evolving. It's going to continue to evolve. We don't have like a want to be in state kind of condition. It's just let's continue evolving as basically the industry evolves. And then how do we adapt and have the right skill sets internally to adapt with it?
And that's definitely, you know, eh, getting more into the technical side and the data analytics, building those skills. I think that's fantastic that you're doing that. I think that's a skill set that will be very powerful for the next generations as everybody becomes more technology driven, right? And maybe one last question, Chris. Um, you and I, just a few years ago, we were youngsters coming up in organizations, and what we thought about those supply chain leaders, right? And now you are a supply chain leader. What belief you have now about supply chain leadership that was different 20 or 30 years ago when you started your career?
I think 20, 30 years ago, I think kind of the culture of not just within my company, but within the industry, I think the culture was quite different from a supply chain standpoint. It was kind of like a culture of do your job, don't complain, and you know just kind of go on with it, um, and stay behind the scenes. I mentioned being invisible before. It was kind of like supply chain was just more of the transactional component of the greater organization. You handle the transactions, the operations, and to me, it's evolved as I mentioned on we have a much bigger seat at the table now. We are involved in much more strategic discussions at the executive level. I think that's very exciting and attractive to people coming up in the organization because they see the influence that we now have from an organizational standpoint that before was perhaps more of an afterthought in the grand scheme of the overall business. So I think that's one thing that's super exciting for the folks that are coming up, and they're seeing that impact. They're seeing how we influence a lot of the core decisions that are getting made. And so I think the more the folks see that, the more motivation it brings to them.
I fully agree with you. Isn't it? I go back in memory lane, and when you and I made our choices about becoming supply chain professional, do a career out of it, neither of us knew that it was going to be so rewarding and so interesting of a career, right?
Absolutely.
So it's definitely thanks for all your insights. I appreciate it. Now, definitely one last question. This is one that I do to all of my guests at the end of every conversation. I was very deliberate on naming the podcast the momentum flow, right? And at the end, it's not only your job, but in the mindset, which mindset or habit or principle helps you keep the momentum going. And it could be at work, it could be in your life and your personal leadership style. What's that one nugget of wisdom that you can share with the audience that has worked for you?
I think it actually goes pretty well with the title of your podcast. It's kind of, go with the flow because, as you mentioned, you're going to wake up every morning and there's something different or something happened overnight. There's a new puzzle, right? So when you know that that's going to be the case, whether it's in your personal life or in your work life, something's going to happen. You got to keep the right mindset to go with the flow. And four words: this too shall pass. Meaning you'll figure it out and move on. And that's what I try to tell my team. Don't get frustrated. We're going to figure it out. Go with the flow and keep the motivation.
you know I love how you use the play of words on that. So thanks for your time, Chris. It's been a fantastic conversation. I enjoyed it a lot. Your insights and decades of experience navigating the auto industry, which is one of the most complex and innovative supply chains on the planet, are great lessons to be shared. uh, to our listeners, if today's conversation sparked ideas or reflections, share with someone in your network who's pushing to build smarter, more resilient, technology-enabled supply chains. Our mission here is very simple: is to connect ideas, people, technologies that are shaping the next generation of resilient, intelligent, and high-performance supply chains. Momentum doesn't happen by accident. It's built through continuous learning, bold thinking, leaders willing to push industry forward. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the series and share with someone in your network who's building or transforming a supply chain of their own. And if you want deeper insights, you can find them on my personal website. And again, this is Luis Solana. Thank you, Chris. And as always, as Chris said, go with the flow, but keep the momentum flow going. Thank you.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you, Luis. My pleasure. Thank you.